Hello and welcome to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, a St. Louis connection, Representative Thomas C. Hennings Jr., and the creation of federal anti-marijuana legislation. I'm John Forrester, and I research the history of cannabis in the Midwest at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. If you want to find out more about me, you can visit my website, and if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please email me at johnsforrester@gmail.com. In this presentation, we are discussing Thomas C. Hennings Jr. He was a U.S. representative that was elected in Missouri's 11th Congressional District, and he served in this role from 1934 to 1940. He is also known as the co-sponsor of the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, the first piece of federal legislation that was intended to control cannabis as a drug. There is no smoking gun in terms of a federal document that says he was the co-sponsor of the Marijuana Tax Act, but biographies, articles about his life, and statements by those that knew him referred to him in this way. What we do concretely know is that Hennings introduced two bills to Congress, one in 1935 and another in 1937, that sought to criminalize cannabis on a federal level, including sales and possession. So, historians have written about the Marijuana Tax Act previously, but they always have focused on the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the Treasury Department's roles in drafting that legislation, or the national social conditions that led to its passage. Few scholars have really looked closely at the congressmen that took part in the introduction of anti-marijuana federal legislation. So this presentation asks what might have influenced Representative Thomas C. Hennings to introduce two bills to Congress in the mid and late 1930s that sought to criminalize cannabis sales and possession. Before we jump into the Marijuana Tax Act, that landmark piece of federal legislation, let's look at some anti-cannabis laws that went into effect prior to that. So in the late 19th century, there were a handful of cities and communities that had local laws targeting use and possession of marijuana. There were a few in Texas, some in the West, and these were mostly targeting Mexican immigrants. St. Louis also had an anti-marijuana law that was a city ordinance that was passed in the early 1880s. At the time, the city of St. Louis was attempting to shut down Chinese immigrant-operated opium dens. And there were a number of efforts by police to raid these places and curb the supply of opium to them. So finding that opium was a little bit more difficult to get, some of the operators of these opium dens started to sell and allow people to consume hashish. After newspapers got wind of this and reported it, officials became concerned and passed a city ordinance that prohibited the use and sales of hashish specifically in Chinese-operated laundries and opium dens. So it was a very specifically written law that combated a specific activity in a specific place. And that's kind of characteristic of a lot of the local laws that combated cannabis in the late 19th century. You also see around that time the passage of state and local laws regulating the labeling and sale of, quote, poisons, so medicinal products that contain narcotics, including cannabis extracts. You've got to remember this is a time when patent medicines were everywhere in the United States, and they contained an array of ingredients with little scientific backing to justify their formulation. So sometimes these medicines would contain cannabis, opium, and arsenic. There was eventually pushback against these patent medicines by medical professionals and the public, and this led the federal government in 1906 to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act, which was attempting to rein in some of the craziness that had gone on in the pharmaceutical industry in the late 19th century. And you start to see some of these patent medicines disappearing off the market, but narcotics in general remain very much available. And in the 20th century, early 20th century, the United States begins to experience a wave of narcotic addiction, mostly involving opiates and cocaine. And again, the federal government steps in to respond. It's 1914, World War I is heating up in Europe, and the U.S. passes the Harrison Narcotics Act, the first federal law that attempts to deal with the issue of drugs. It does not cover cannabis, and that's because medical professionals objected to its inclusion in the legislation, because at that time, cannabis was still very much used as a medical product. The issue of drug addiction remains a major topic in national politics moving forward into the 20th century. And in 1930, President Herbert Hoover establishes the Federal Bureau of Narcotics under the U.S. Department of Treasury, a federal agency that is intended to regulate and enforce anti-narcotic laws. In 1935, just 5 years later, there's a lot going on with narcotics and marijuana specifically on both the state and federal levels. So Missouri passes a state law criminalizing possession and sale of marijuana. Hennings, having recently arrived in Washington, D.C. and joined the House of Representatives, introduces a marijuana criminalization bill in Congress. And also, the federal government opens its first, quote, narcotic farm for the treatment of drug addicts in Lexington, Kentucky. There's a whole body of scholarship out there on the narcotic farm that I encourage anyone listening to this to read. It was quite controversial. Just 2 years later, in 1937, not one, but 5 anti-marijuana bills were introduced to Congress. It was clear that lawmakers wanted something to happen with marijuana on the federal level. One of these bills, the Marijuana Tax Act, was passed and signed by President Roosevelt that August. So what was the Marijuana Tax Act? It was the first piece of federal legislation that specifically targeted use of cannabis as a drug. So previous laws pertaining to narcotics did not address drug cannabis. Because the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was an arm of the U.S. Department of Treasury, the way this law was written was around taxes. Taxes, finances were a way that the Federal Bureau of Narcotics could enforce laws. That was within their purview as an arm of the Department of Treasury. So the Marijuana Tax Act was written, if you couldn't tell from the name, around taxation. And what it imposed was what was called a prohibitive tax. And the idea was putting a really annoying, kind of expensive tax on the sale, importation, and distribution of marijuana. And the thought was that the legitimate retailers, distributors, and importers of cannabis would not want to pay this tax, and that the traffic in that drug would eventually taper off on its own. The Marijuana Tax Act was drafted by Treasury officials. So under the direction of Commissioner Harry J. Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Treasury officials literally wrote this bill to make sure that it went through and would be enforceable. Several versions, as I mentioned earlier, of anti-marijuana legislation were introduced to Congress that year. The Treasury Department and the FBN did not support all of those bills. The Marijuana Tax Act was viewed as a viable option because they had a hand in writing it. And the Marijuana Tax Act, the way it was written was sort of, because it involved taxes, right? On the surface, it was intended to curb sales and distribution and importation of the drug rather than policing individual use of the drug. However, the federal law was, in fact, used for that purpose, and that proved to be a part of its downfall. So the Marijuana Tax Act remained in effect until 1969 when a Supreme Court case, Timothy Leary versus the United States of America, happened, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Marijuana Tax Act violated our Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So, who was Hennings? How did he get it to where he was in the House of Representatives? Let's go back to his birth. So he was born in 1903 to a St. Louis Circuit Court judge, his namesake, Thomas C. Hennings Sr. He followed in his dad's footsteps and studied law at Wash U, and he graduated in 1926 and was admitted to the Missouri bar that same year. After a few years of private practice in 1929, he was hired as assistant circuit attorney for the city of St. Louis, where he was primarily involved in prosecuting felony crimes. From 1932 to 1936, he was a colonel, which is an honorary title, on the Missouri governor's staff. So his role with the city of St. Louis and the Missouri governor's staff show that he was very closely enmeshed with the power structures of both the city of St. Louis and the state of Missouri. From 1934 to 1938, Hennings was an instructor of criminal jurisprudence at Benton College of Law in St. Louis. So criminal law was his bread and butter. That is the way he thought about law. And in 1935, Hennings was elected to the U.S. House of Reps, and he joined that body on January 3rd, 1935. That's important to remember. Remember that Hennings became a U.S. representative in January 1935. So now we're starting to explore some of the factors that might have driven Hennings to introduce these anti-marijuana bills. Let's start with looking at the district he represented. And I want you to remember this footprint. You can see at the top in yellow where Forest Park is. You can kind of use that as a landmark, but what we're looking at is marked in green, and that is the 11th Congressional District. And you can see that it covers some of the most politically and commercially important areas of the city of St. Louis. Downtown St. Louis, the riverfront, going west to Forest Park. This is where there was a lot of people, money, and power. By the way, this map comes to us from the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library. These blue maps we see were digitized by the Public Library of St. Louis. So this is showing the density of population of St. Louis as reflected in the 1930 census. And you can see the district that Hennings represented contains some of the most densely populated areas of the city. The census that year revealed that St. Louis was the 7th largest city in the country with over 800,000 people living within its limits. So Hennings had a lot of constituents to serve. When you have a density of people, there's also crime that comes along with that. And you can see this sort of statistical representation of criminal court cases from 1929 to 1934, and there's just a ton of them in the district that Hennings represented. He also, again, had worked as assistant circuit attorney during this period, the same period, and would have been familiar with how much crime was occurring in his district. And on the right here, it's a little bit outside of the period that the map covers, but this is about a mass arrest that occurred for marijuana in 1936. And I looked up the address, 2827 Dixon Street, and the structure no longer exists, so it's difficult to tell exactly where it was. But it looks like it's within Hennings's district, or it might just be right over the border. But nonetheless, it just is an example that this cannabis-related crimes were occurring in this area in St. Louis at the time before and during Hennings's tenure as a U.S. rep. And this is another view of those criminal court cases. This is an article from the St. Louis Star-Times from December 1934, and you can see the headline, "Boys Find Dope, Cheap Stimulant, and Enter Road to Lifelong Misery. High school pupils here, eager for thrills, ensnared by vicious peddlers who grow rich on misery." So the newspapers are talking about this type of crime growing in St. Louis as Hennings is preparing to enter Congress. It was a topic of discussion in St. Louis in the media and undoubtedly also in society. This is a view of juvenile delinquency from 1930 to 1934. And here's another Star-Times article from January 1935. "St. Louis's newest evil, the dope cigarette, menacing ranks of youth. Cigarettes made of dope on sale in St. Louis." And you can see there's just a high density of juvenile delinquents in Hennings district. And at the same time, local media is making this connection between crime, young people, and marijuana. And that would have been difficult for Hennings to ignore, particularly as somebody who had interest and experience in criminal law. Here's another view of that juvenile delinquency data and another article. So this is from January 1935. "Young slaves of dope cigarette pay tragic price for their folly." So again, you just see a huge concentration of juvenile delinquency in the district that Hennings represented that had to have been something on his radar. And again, one of the most major daily newspapers in St. Louis was making a point to call out this connection between young people, marijuana, and crime, or what they saw as a connection. Again, with the population density, there were a lot of African Americans that lived in the district that Hennings represented. And you can see this quote just after the 1938 election from the St. Louis Argus, a newspaper that served African Americans in St. Louis, that speaks to his popularity with the black community in that district. The black community in St. Louis was aware of cannabis before the state and federal laws were passed. The St. Louis Argus covered it both as a criminal issue, as you can see here on the right, held as reefer peddler, but they also discussed cannabis as just a part of daily life that African Americans could encounter in the city. On the left, you see the Spunky and Dunky, which was a column describing life in St. Louis casually. And this describes an incident where an African American had encountered cannabis smokers just walking out and about in St. Louis. But from this map showing the density of St. Louis's black population, you see the district that he represented wasn't homogeneously black or wasn't homogeneously white. It was like most American cities at that time and then. It was a mix of people from different backgrounds. But there were undoubtedly a lot of African Americans that lived in this area and in this district. So this is an article from 1931 from the Star-Times, and it basically says that the city circuit attorney issued a warrant against the owner or the proprietor of a novelty store on Olive Street for selling marijuana and hashish without a proper poison label. So again, turning to these late 19th century, turn of the century laws regarding poisons to prosecute marijuana cases. Again, this is when Hennings was assistant circuit attorney, so he was undoubtedly at least aware of this case, but he very well may have been involved in this case as well and may have been the prosecutor. There isn't much information beyond this one article, but we do know that this marijuana case came across the circuit attorney's office in 1931. When Hennings was there, he was probably aware of it. So, throughout the 1930s, there were anti-marijuana messages circulating in popular culture across the United States. So, there were a number of films: Road to Ruin, Reefer Madness, which was originally titled Tell Your Children, Marijuana, and Assassin of Youth, that appeared in theaters all around the United States. And below that, you can see some ads from St. Louis newspapers for the film Marijuana. On the left is an ad from 1936 that appeared in the Globe Democrat. And the bigger ad was in the St. Louis Argus, the newspaper for African American community, in 1937. At the same time, there were pro-marijuana messages circulating in popular culture during the 1930s. Really, from the mid-20s through the mid-20th century, there were a number of jazz and blues musicians that wrote and recorded marijuana-themed songs. And you can see a list of them here from an academic journal article. One of the most famous of these songs was called Reefer Man, recorded by New York-based jazz musician Cab Calloway. Cab Calloway became a big celebrity of his day, and he was in Hollywood movies, and his records became popular across the United States. Here's a little glimpse at his influence on St. Louis. He came here in 1933, and the St. Louis Argus reported that the mayor gave him a key to the city. When he performed a show at the arena that night, he performed Minnie the Moocher, which had, if you've ever heard of someone mooching your cannabis, that's where that comes from. That song had tons of marijuana references in it. So on the right, you see several references to the Reefer Man song. So the top article says the floor show at the Golden Lily, a St. Louis club, was reminiscent of the Cab Calloway rendition of My Reefer Man. And then below that, you see a mention of the Fultonettes performing Reefer Man at a performance in 1936. So Reefer Man was a popular song. People performed it locally. Cab Calloway came here and was celebrated as a celebrity. These messages were about, these pro-cannabis messages were circulating through music and popular culture. At the same time, news media, had been condemning marijuana for quite some time, both in St. Louis and around the United States. What you see here is an article from August 1924, the St. Louis Globe Democrat Sunday magazine, Mystery of the Strange Mexican Weed. I love this image because in the top right, there's a weird, wolf, devil-like thing coming out of the smoke. You got the guy in the sombrero, and then the mysterious shadowy figure near the smoke and the fire. It all makes marijuana look pretty dangerous and bad. And they even say that it leads to violence way back in 1924. But for the most part, most coverage of marijuana in Missouri and in the United States cast it as a foreign substance from Mexico, from Asia, that was brought here. It was a dangerous foreign influence. But in the 1930s, newspapers in the US and in Missouri started to describe cannabis as more of a local issue. So in April 1934, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch publishes a major article on marijuana use at the University of Kansas. Again, I love this image. You've got the dragon puffing out smoke, the really uptight looking older white men, saying this is an issue. But this article generated a lot of public conversation about marijuana. The newspaper received a number of letters to the editor about it. And of course, it attracted some attention because it involved young people, students at university, people you wouldn't think of using narcotics per se at that time. And right on the heels of that article, the St. Louis Globe-Democrat published another article that focused on marijuana use in St. Louis. And surprise, surprise, it also focuses on, quote, young people. Again, just kind of sensationalizing the issue and drawing attention to its purported hazards to young people. October 1934, you see officials trying to prosecute a marijuana case, again under poison laws. And what a shocker, the person being prosecuted was very likely a Mexican-American immigrant, Luis Minez. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The judge said, "Smoking of this drug has become widespread in the underworld, I am informed. It is as dangerous as heroin, cocaine, heroin, or morphine." So again, there's major news of marijuana as a hazard, of it being a crime. This is when Hennings was still assistant circuit attorney. He was undoubtedly aware of this case. And in 1934, Hennings, who has clearly had some political aspirations, decides to run for the 11th Congressional District seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. On the right, you see an article endorsing his candidacy that appeared in the St. Louis Argus in October 1934, and it says, "An exponent of a New Deal." He was a Democrat, he was known as a supporter of the New Deal and FDR. That November, he won the seat, and he soon headed out to Washington, D.C. to begin his public service. So right around the time that Hennings is joining Congress, the St. Louis daily newspaper, the St. Louis Star-Times, orchestrates an anti-marijuana crusade. By crusade, I mean a series of articles that were intended to spark some sort of legislative or civic change. In this case, the newspaper was advocating for the passage of state and federal laws curbing marijuana sales and use. So you can get a little view of the different headlines. Many of them dealt with young people, also casting it as a criminal issue, connecting marijuana with violence. But this is going on January and February 1935, right as Hennings is getting his start in Congress. And at the end of February 1935, Governor Park signs the state marijuana law, and the substance becomes illegal in Missouri. And it was one of many states that had enacted anti-marijuana laws by that point. Missouri was by no means early in that game. Just kind of a zooming out for a second to see, what conversations were going on around cannabis at that time. The St. Louis Medical Society, which you can kind of view as a part of the elites of St. Louis, expressed support for federal anti-marijuana legislation. So you have a group of doctors that say the substance is bad, we need to ban it, which is interesting considering that medical professionals had pretty much consistently objected to the inclusion of cannabis in federal anti-narcotics laws up until this point. On the right, you see an article from January 1935. Debutantes and escorts appear in farcical fashions at party for Miss Anne Beck Woolsey. And at that party, a Miss Marjorie Chrysler dressed up as a marijuana cigarette smoker. So you have elites on one hand condemning marijuana as a hazard to society, and on the other hand, dressing up as marijuana users for society parties. So flash forward a few months, Hennings is getting his feet, on solid ground in the House of Reps, and he introduces a bill that attempts to outlaw marijuana on a federal level. I'm going to leave this up for a second. You can kind of see from the text of this bill that it doesn't really involve taxation. So that's probably the primary reason that it didn't end up being enacted during that session. It ended up dying in the House, and it probably died because it just didn't have teeth that allowed it to be enforced by the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. There had to be some sort of financial or taxation angle to it, and this did not have it. This was probably a reflection of the way that Missouri wrote its state law against marijuana, which rendered it as a criminal issue and imposed criminal penalties. So that's kind of what's reflected here. And also, probably Hennings's background as a criminal prosecutor. 2 months later, we see the first prosecution for a violation of Missouri marijuana law in St. Louis. And again, the person that was charged and convicted was most likely a Mexican-American immigrant, Ruben Barrientos. September 1935, the American Legion, which was then a very politically influential group of veterans, passes an anti-marijuana resolution at its annual convention held in St. Louis. It's unclear if Hennings was at this event or not, but he may have read about this or heard about it from someone. But nonetheless, it was probably on his radar because the American Legion was such a politically influential organization at that time. So momentum is building for a federal marijuana law in early 1936. The commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry J. Anslinger, holds a meeting on the marijuana issue at a hotel in New York City. And there are scientists there, lawmakers, and they're discussing ways they can effectively prohibit access to cannabis and criminalize it. And part of that entails a discussion of different parts of the plant that contained the psychoactive substances and which didn't, so that they could get the language of the law down and create legislation that would be really effective. Anslinger was a big proponent of criminalizing marijuana. This on the right, you can see an article he published in the American magazine called "Marijuana: The Assassin of Youth." You may remember from a couple slides back, there was a film produced in 1937 called "Assassin of Youth." So he had tremendous influence on Americans' perception of drugs as a public health and criminal issue. He held the position as commissioner of the FBN for a long time. He was there from 1930 to 1963. So he had a direct hand in shaping U.S. federal narcotic policy for over 3 decades, and even longer than that, because after he retired, he remained on different commissions and things. His voice remained very much a part of public discussions on narcotics. So as this momentum is building, Hennings senses this, and in April 1936, the St. Louis Star-Times, actually on April 20th, 1936, the Star-Times reports that Hennings is considering reintroducing that anti-marijuana bill. At the start of the legislative session in January 1937, we see a wave of anti-marijuana bills introduced to Congress. So the first of them was introduced by Representative Hamilton Fish III, a Republican from New York. And you can see in the text of H.R. 229, it prohibits the importation of cannabis indica, cannabis sativa, or cannabis americana for the purpose of making the narcotic drug known as marijuana, or for any other purpose. Nothing about taxation in there, so it was not viewed as being that viable to enforce. But this was the first that was introduced that legislative session. A day later, a second bill is introduced in the Senate by Senator Carl Hatch, a Democrat from New Mexico. S-325 prohibits the shipment or transportation in interstate or foreign commerce of cannabis and its derivatives and compounds except to licensed physicians, dentists, druggists, and veterinarians under the regulations of the Commissioner of Narcotics. So again, this is a little bit more viable for enforcement because it places the enforcement of this law under the Commissioner of Narcotics. But again, there's nothing about taxation in here or that gives this arm of the Treasury Department some teeth to enforce this. Like Hennings, Hatch had actually introduced a version of this bill in 1935. So Hennings and Hatch were two of the earliest congressmen that were advocating for laws curbing marijuana supply and use. At the end of January 1937, Hennings enters the foray and puts forth a third bill, H.R. 3873, which prohibits the sale, possession, and transportation of cannabis and its derivative compounds except to licensed physicians, dentists, pharmacists, druggists, and veterinarians except under the regulations of the Commissioner of Narcotics. So very similar to the Hatch bill. Hennings may have been working directly with Hatch, and this could have been a dual attempt to try to ensure the passage of this legislation in either chamber. But again, you see nothing about taxation. It's a little bit closer because, like the Hatch bill, the enforcement is placed under the Commissioner of Narcotics. And you can see on the right here, Hennings renews effort to get U.S. ban on marijuana. This move generated press coverage in his hometown, in his district. So regardless of whether or not he was successful in this effort, it generated some positive publicity for him. And when, U.S. representatives have a 2-year term limit, so they're always in a state of campaigning. So any publicity like this is good for a U.S. rep, particularly at that time. So flash forward to April 14th, 1947. A fourth bill is introduced by Robert L. Doughton, a Democrat of North Carolina. And this bill, H.R. 6385, did reflect the input of the Treasury Department and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. You can see from the wording of this bill, for one, it bears the name, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, so you can see this is the first draft of what became the final federal law, and it very much has to deal with taxation. And again, it places the authority for the enforcement of these laws under the Treasury. So it's more viable for the realities of how drug laws were enforced at that time. And the St. Louis Star-Times covered this, and they noted a bill to make possession, transportation, or sale of marijuana a felony was introduced in a session by Representative Thomas C. Hennings Jr. of St. Louis, but the Doughton bill is almost certain to take precedence over it as it has administration support. So remember, in an earlier slide, I discussed how the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Treasury Department had a direct hand in drafting the language of this bill, and that's what this is referencing. From April and through May, the House Ways and Means Committee held a couple hearings on House Bill 6385. The Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry J. Anslinger, appears in these hearings and he submits several documents in support of his position. One of them was by Frank R. Gamilla, who was the Commissioner of Public Safety for New Orleans at the time. And in his statement, he makes direct reference to the series of St. Louis Star-Times articles that called out marijuana as a hazard to children. So we can see that those St. Louis Star-Times articles had an influence on Missouri politics and national politics, and undoubtedly on Hennings himself. On May 10, 1937, a fifth and different bill, H.R. 6906, that had been amended, was introduced by Doughton again. So this is what allegedly or reportedly Hennings was a co-sponsor of. The thing is, I cannot find any official federal government document that says he was a co-sponsor. You can see the text I have above is from the Digest of Public General Bills with Index 75th Congress First Session. And whenever they discuss bills in there, they only list one sponsor. So for any piece of legislation that's mentioned in there, it's impossible to discern who was a co-sponsor because it only lists one person. However, biographies about Hennings, statements by people that knew him, and newspaper articles frequently mention that he was a co-sponsor of this bill. Sometimes he is referred to as a co-author as well. Regardless, we do know he introduced those two other bills that attempted to control marijuana. So the Doughton bill, this H.R. 6906, gains momentum. It's passed in the House. It's passed by the Senate eventually. And President Roosevelt signs it on August 2nd. Not long after that, in October 1937, we see the first prosecution for a violation of the federal marijuana law in St. Louis. Actually, police officers had seized a bunch of marijuana from Kimmswick, Missouri, and the case was prosecuted in St. Louis. So the law went into effect October 1st, and law enforcement officials wasted no time in arresting someone. The arrest was reported on October 9th in St. Louis newspapers. So, like I said, the House of Representatives term is 2 years. So anyone that's a representative is in a constant state of campaigning. In late 1938, ahead of the election in November, Hennings is hitting the streets in St. Louis trying to make a case for re-election. And local newspapers report that he, at a speech at the Disabled Veterans Club at 3737 West Pine Boulevard, that he discussed his role in the passage of that marijuana law. So clearly Hennings viewed his participation in the enactment of federal anti-marijuana legislation as an achievement, something worthy of sharing with the public that would hopefully encourage them to re-elect him. So what to make of all of this? What might have influenced Hennings to submit these two anti-marijuana bills to Congress? One was his background. Hennings' bills reflected his experience as an assistant circuit attorney and his experience prosecuting felony crimes. His expertise was in criminal law. So that's the way he wrote his legislation. His approach to federal anti-marijuana legislation also was similar to the way that Missouri tackled that issue, which also cast cannabis as a criminal issue with criminal penalties. Cannabis was also a major topic in national politics and popular culture, so he was capitalizing on a moment where the drug was a significant topic in political conversations, media coverage, and in pop culture. And it was a major topic in national local media. So he was doing something that was very timely and that would get attention in the media and provide him with positive coverage that would help him get reelected. Which brings us to a political opportunity. The fact that Hennings referenced his role in the Marijuana Tax Act during his 1938 campaign suggests that his work on the issue was viewed as a way to advance his political career. And some evidence of that is the fact that Hennings remained focused on narcotics control and associated issues like juvenile delinquency throughout his political career. So these are some articles covering some stuff he was doing in Congress in the late 50s, early 60s, where he was drawing attention to marijuana traffic, young people using narcotics, and attempting to foster change. So again, we don't know if truly, we don't have a smoking gun federal document that says he was a co-sponsor of the Marijuana Tax Act, but we do know he submitted those two bills, and he certainly said he was associated with the passage of that law. So regardless, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 became a part of Hennings's legacy. On the left, you can see a biography of Hennings from the State of Missouri Official Manual for the years 1957 and 1958. And it mentions he was the original sponsor of the anti-marijuana law. An article that appeared in the Hanover, Pennsylvania Evening Sun in 1954, promoting his appearance at a meeting of a local organization, noted he was also the original sponsor of the anti-marijuana law. An article covering his death that appeared in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat in 1960 said he sponsored the first federal marijuana law. So, while we can't pinpoint exactly which, if he was involved in the Marijuana Tax Act specifically, he had made marijuana a significant political issue on the national stage and used it to advance his political career. So that's how there is a connection between St. Louis and the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Thank you for listening.